Hello, students. It's Mr. Weaver. Today, I want to go over Chapter 6 of Lord of the Flies, Beast from Air. A few observations that I made. First of all, we have this man who has been shot down in the air above the island in his parachute. This is after the kids have gone to sleep. And on page 95, it says that there is a sign from the grown-ups. In fact, it says, "But a sign came down from the world of grown-ups, though at the time there was no child awake to read it." Why is this not just some man in a parachute? Why is this a sign? What do you mean it's a sign? And you'll recall from the end of chapter 5 on page 94 that Ralph says, if they could only send us something grown up, a sign or something. Why is the sign a dead man in a parachute floating down to the island? Good question. So I wanted to point out, this is number 2 on your notes here, that there's this literary technique that William Golding uses a lot, where instead of just saying Ralph does something or Simon or Sam or Eric, he uses certain body parts or some vague reference to them instead of just using their names. And instead of calling the man in the parachute a man, he calls it a figure. Okay? Calls it a figure. He mentions the head and the chest and the dangling arms, but he doesn't call it a man. He calls it a figure and a sign. What is he doing by kind of dehumanizing that? But he also does it with Sam and Eric a few pages later on page 98. In fact, it says on page 98, second big paragraph, they became motionless, gripped in each other's arms, 4 unwinking eyes aimed, and 2 mouths opened. So it's really interesting that he kind of almost dehumanizes them to their mouths and their eyes. A little bit later, it says, neither of the boys screamed, but the grip of their arms tightened, their mouths grew peaked. There's a lot of emphasis on certain body parts rather than on the boys themselves as a whole. Why does Golding do that? It's a literary technique. I wonder what he's doing with that. It's a good question. As we continue, the boys, when they go back to the fire after they've seen this dead man in the parachute, they don't see that though, right? Because of the fire and because of the shadows, they only see some kind of figure rising and going down, which is basically as the parachute gets caught by the wind and this man is festooned or caught in the ropes. When the parachute gets blown by the wind, it pulls his body up, and then when the wind lets down, his body goes back down. Okay, and so they see that, but they don't know what it is. They interpret it as the beast, and they describe it as claws, furry teeth, eyes. Did they see any of that? No, they're embellishing it. And I wanted to point that out. That's really interesting. That's on page 100. They say things like, that was awful. It kind of sat up. The fire was bright. We just made it up. More sticks on. There were eyes, teeth, claws, bashed into things. The beast followed us. I saw it slinking behind the trees, nearly touched me. That didn't really happen. That's how they interpreted it. Why is that? Well, we'll keep thinking about what happens with fear and what that does to our interpretation. On page 101, there's this really important moment. There's, of course, a confrontation between Jack and Ralph about what they should do about the beast. And at the bottom of the page, after they talk about Piggy being full of fear, Jack says, "Conk, conk," shouted Jack. "We don't need the conk anymore. We know who ought to say things." And he moves on. And this really infuriates Ralph. Folks, he said they don't need the conch. If that conch is a symbol of order, civilization, democracy, Jack is saying we don't need that. What's causing that to happen? The only thing that stops the breakup of the civilization at this point, because Jack is about to just like start a mutiny, is that Ralph brings up rescue again. It's like rescue is the thing holding the boys together. This idea of maybe they can be rescued, and we talked about it we talked about that in a previous video. Simon then has this interpretation of the beast in his mind, and I have to read this to you. It's on page 103. It's toward the bottom, middle bottom. It says, however, Simon thought of the beast. There rose before his inward sight the picture of a human at once heroic and sick. Simon sees past the embellishment, past the facade, and he realizes maybe this beast is like a human, At least that's the picture he's getting in his mind. There's something about the perception and insight of Simon that he sees past the illusion into the reality that it's really the boys that are the issue. And he says something about human nature, that we are heroic and we are sick, that there's this goodness, but there's this inherent sickness in human beings. He then, 2 pages later, says straight up, I don't believe in the beast. And Ralph, he's like, well, I suppose not. Okay, because like they see him as kind of batty is the word. He's like crazy, but he's not. He's just really perceptive, but he can't articulate what he's thinking and feeling. Number 7 here on our list, we get a lot of description on pages 104 to 106 of this island, this rocky island that juts off of the main island. And it's made out of these really big pieces of granite. There's a bridge that goes across. This is a really important place because it's going to be very important later on. I'll just call it a rocky island for now. And you will recall that Ralph is the bravest one who goes across to see if the beast is on the island. Jack follows. And then, of course, there's this disagreement here, number 9, with Ralph and Jack. And that's because Jack sees this as a wicked fort, he says. And a bunch of the other kids want it to be a fort. And Ralph finally is like, there's no smoke. There's no smoke. And Jack's like, you're crazy with this smoke thing. And at the end of the chapter, it says that the boys mutinously are talking. Mutiny is like going against authority. And it says that Jack leads them across the bridge. That's almost like a symbolic statement that Jack is leading them across the bridge into a new part of this story where Jack is going to try to take over. You can see it coming. What's the purpose of the chapter? To show this increased fear in the boys, to introduce us to the rocky island, to show Jack leading at the end, and to develop Simon's incredulity. Incredulity is not believing, and also his insight about human beings. So here's some questions to consider as we move on. What is that sign that the grown-ups are giving us in the chapter? Why can't they read it? What's the sign? Maybe that sign is a sign that maybe we should be interpreting. What is that? Number 2, how do we respond to like fear as human beings? Do we exaggerate it? Do we get confident? Do we fight it? Do we see it as maybe the thing to fear is not something on the outward, but on the inward, as Simon would say, that it's really human beings that we ought to fear? How do we respond to fear as humans? That's a really good, just basic question about humanity. And then finally, we see here that Jack uses fear to gain authority. How do leaders, and this is just in general, how do they use fear to undermine democracy, to undermine order, to say, hey, you should be afraid, therefore we're not going to do things the way we used to do them? When does that happen? How is that dangerous, or how is that good? That's a big question that we need to ask. I hope this has been helpful, and keep reading.